Morning everyone, and welcome to another Insight APSAD webinar. My name's Jim Hunt. I'm one of the nurse educators here at Insight. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on who we're meeting today and pay our respect to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd like to extend that welcome and respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders that might be joining us in the room or indeed on webinar land. So welcome and thank you. Today it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Cynthia Forlini, who's a lecturer at Deakin University in the School of Medicine, and she's going to do a presentation on treatment enhancement or lifestyle choice, the ethics of intervening in cognitive performance. So please welcome Dr. Cynthia Forlini.
Thanks so much, Jim, and thanks for everyone who's here, and welcome to everyone in webinar land. And a heartfelt thanks for this invitation to present at the Insight APSAD webinar. Some of the work that you're going to see that I'm going to talk about today, and a lot of the thinking around this work was done right here in Brisbane when I was a young postdoc, so thanks so much for bringing me home. So in planning this seminar, I tried to resist the urge to condense over a decade of work into a 1-hour seminar. And instead, what I've tried to do is to distill some essential considerations about so-called cognitive enhancers for you in your roles as healthcare professionals. So I'll give you a glimpse at the context that I think is driving this interest in cognitive enhancement and intervening in the brain and cognition. We'll look at a couple of the definitional approaches. What do we call it? What's happening? How do we actually talk about this thing that we call cognitive enhancement? And you'll see that there are many definitional approaches, plural, and that's made it kind of tricky to study what we kind of implicitly understand as people doing things to perform better. And then I'll introduce some practical considerations about safety, efficacy, and prevalence. And so we're going to address the FAQ of does it work, who's doing it, how common is it, to then segue into some of the ethical considerations about not only the empirical evidence of who's doing it and why, but is this okay? Is this something that we want as part of our society, as part of healthcare perhaps even? Does that sound good for everybody?
Sounds great.
Everyone said yes. Okay. So let's start by taking a step back and looking at the big picture. Where are we, and why is there so much ado about cognitive enhancement? And to do that, I want to introduce you to Ethel. Has anybody seen Ethel before? So she is the spokeswoman for Frank's Red Hot, and it's a popular hot sauce in North America. And I've seen it around here too, and what she says is that she puts that, it's a bad word under there. So she puts that hot sauce on everything. So it goes with everything. And I would say over the last 15 years, it seems like the neuro prefix is kind of like that hot sauce, right? You can neuro just about anything. Yeah. And it's made these specialties of neuro law and neuropolitics and neuromarketing. I'm not going to read them all out, but there's lots of them, and you can neuro anything. And we talk about all of these emerging neuro fields, and each of them promises to tell us more about who we are and how we are and why we are the way we are. And all of them do it by referring to neuroscience and the study of our brains. And that, to me, is the essence of living in a neuro society, where neuroscience kind of gives us the power to talk and think about everything and to actually intervene. And I think that's what's really driving the interest in this phenomenon of cognitive enhancement. So I'm going to be coming at this from my neuro field of choice, and that's neuroethics. Has anybody heard of neuroethics before? Yes, no? Good. So it's out there. And so neuroethics is a new field, not so new anymore. I think it's a nicely established field, but it's part of contemporary bioethics, and it focuses on the ethics of neuroscience research and related clinical specialties such as neurology, neurosurgery, and psychiatry. So that was kind of an initial definition. But it emerged because of bioethics' lack of attention to issues having to do with rapid innovation in neuroscience and the development of neurotechnology, which was happening way faster than the time that we could take to sit down and realize, well, how is this neurotechnology working in the clinical space? How is it working in society? And so neuroethics came to think about that a little bit more. And what it does, I think, is it captures this intimate link between the brain and ourselves. It helps us think through that more so than bioethics or kind of any other discipline helps us do that. And since it's expanded into looking more at research, neuroscience research, but also within the clinical space that you work in, but also the public understanding of what we know about the brain and what we can actually do to our brains. So kind of public understanding of neuroscience, science communication around neuroinnovation. And neuroethics also encompasses this idea of, well, how does neuroscience affect kind of philosophical concepts? Free will, for example, right? The more we learn about our decision making, how does that affect this idea that we self-determine and we choose in the way that we want? So that's the space within which I operate. But the central aspect here remains that neuroethics looks at what we should be doing to and with our brains. So in ethics, this should question is the overarching one and the one that I ask all the time. So the neurosociety that we live in, I think, has been evolving as neuroscience evidence is kind of integrated into messages about how we should be living. So public and health policy is a really good place to start looking for these messages. And I think that's really the crux of the neuroethics perspective, this idea that neuroscience can help us understand how we should be living. Sorry, the neuroethics perspective, not the neuroscience perspective. And I think this neurosociety is really what's inspiring this drive or this curiosity for different types of neuro and cognitive interventions. So I have up here one of my all-time favorite studies, of the world, okay? Brewer and Pickersgill looked at public and health policy across the UK, across the lifespan, looking for where neuroscience was used, where neuroscience appears, how it was used, what does it help us do, and what were the messages that were associated with that. And they found 3 themes that each attributed a responsibility to a stakeholder, okay? And what it did is it says you, young person, you adolescent, you older person. Everybody is responsible for their brain health. Why? Because of these 3 themes. One talks about optimization, because healthy brains can maximize human potential, right? You have a healthy brain, you can do whatever it is that you want to do. Okay, you can be who you want to be, you can contribute in the whatever ways. You are born with everything you need biologically, okay? And it's up to you to make sure that you're making the most of it. And how do you do that? You keep your brain healthy. They also found a theme of self-governance, so that if we have healthy brains, we're in better shape. We can take better care of ourselves. We, this was especially prevalent in the context of aging, that we are, perhaps not predisposed to dementia, and we're living longer, living more productively. It links into concepts of resilience, right? That if we're mentally strong, we'll be able to face whatever it is that comes our way. And it encourages this kind of proactive approach to taking care of your health. So it's also a public health message about just doing what's good for you. And the last one, which was especially prevalent in discourses around adolescence, and perhaps very relevant for you, is this idea of vulnerability, right? So healthy brains will be able to identify where there's a risk. We'll be able to reason and decide in ways that are right. I use that in quotation marks, that socially desirable perhaps, or consistent with policies and laws and things that we know are good, and avoid things that we know are bad. And in general, avoid risky behavior. So when you look at these three themes, I think that the message that they're communicating is that if we fix the brain, we fix the problem, okay? And these can be many types of problems, right? So optimization, we fix, kids who are struggling in school. We fix an aging workforce. Self-governance, we fix social and health care, because people won't need it as much. Vulnerability, we fix, maybe juvenile delinquency. So there are many problems. They can be social, they can be economic. And all of them have this neuroscience root, according to this study. And I'm currently actually looking at Australian policy to see whether there are any similarities or differences, or if maybe here neuroscience gets used in different contexts. So watch this space for that. And what I've come to observe in these messages about the responsibility for cognitive health is that not only is it a responsibility, it's a moral responsibility to care for cognitive health. And I think it comes across in two ways. The first one is to be an active and productive member of society. So that's this idea of optimization and self-governance, that you're contributing, you're innovating, you're being productive, you're doing something good in whatever context that you find yourself. And the second one derives from brain plasticity. So this idea that the brain can and does change over time. So no, it's not, you're not born with X amount of neurons, and all the damage that you do, well, you lose neurons, and that's just too bad because you're never gonna make them anymore, and your brain's not gonna change, and that's just it. That's not true, okay? We're changing our brains every single day. When we learn something new, when we do a crossword, when we go out for a run. So this idea that you can change your brain, to me suggests that maybe what the message actually here is that you must change your brain, okay? You can do something about it, so why aren't you doing something about it? These are all tools. We can all go for a run. We can all, do a Sudoku. We can all learn a new language. It's your responsibility. You have to do it. So we've taken a step back. That's, I think, the broad context in which we're operating. Let's take a couple steps closer. We use cognitive enhancement as a catch-all terms for interventions that intend to improve cognition, okay? So that is the most general definition I could possibly give. And I'm sure it is a term that's familiar to all of you. Yes, you've heard cognitive enhancement. It's used in the clinical sense as well, because you can enhance. Enhancement just means an improvement. It doesn't matter where you start, right? It just means something's getting better. And I will confess this to all of you, and all of you listening in the web, and recorded for everyone to see on the internet, I do not like this term. I try not to use it. I think it's been set up as this monolith that is all-encompassing, and it fails to capture the details that help us determine whether a practice is ethical, acceptable, laudable, unethical. There are so many details that come into play when we're deciding if things are okay or not. But the challenge is that essentially all of the other terms also have some kind of built-in assumption, or kind of, maybe if you want to call it a bias, or you can call it a detail that makes that they're not actually neutral terms. The term that I tended to use in my early research about stimulants was the non-medical use of prescription stimulants. But even there, you're making an assumption that whatever people are using is non-medical. And if it's non-medical, maybe they shouldn't be doing it, right? So all of the terms are problematic, and let me show you why. So generally, we can speak of cognitive enhancement in many different contexts, but as a starting point, I want to show you a couple of definitions from the bioethics literature, just to show you how hard it really is. So very generally, we speak about amplification or extension of core capacities of the mind through improvement or augmentation of internal or external information processing systems. Does anybody have an ethical objection to this definition? Is your spidey sense tingling? Do you say, nah, no good? No, right? It's general. Who doesn't want to improve? Right? But in this definition, what we're doing is we're equating using a notepad as a memory aid to using a prescription stimulant to do better on a test. Does that seem fair? Does that seem right? Does that sit well with you? No, the faces are saying no. The faces are not convinced, right? So whoever's listening to this on the web, people are not convinced that that is a fair equation. And I agree, that's probably not quite appropriate. So maybe we can concentrate directly on the technology, right? So let's have a look. So cognitive enhancement can be drugs and other interventions to modify brain processes with the aim of enhancing memory, mood, attention in people who are not impaired by illness or disorder. So let's check in again. How are we feeling about this definition? Sorry, is it the same?
It's the same. Essentially, it would, it looks fine, but again, I've got my aid to enhance my memory in a notebook, but then I, could also be taking a bit of meth.
Okay, so notebook plus meth is those. But to me, this definition says that we've actually forgotten about the notebook. The notebook, meh, it's not a problem for us. And we're focusing on specific, core capabilities. So we're looking at memory, mood, and attention. So we're starting to get a little bit more specific about what we actually mean. But we're not sure if this is quite better, right? No one's jumping up and down, outraged about a definition. Okay, so let's try this one. What about intention? Because I think your intention is also quite important when we're deciding if something is ethical or acceptable. So what if we said that cognitive enhancement was designed to produce improvements in human form or function that do not respond to legitimate medical needs? How are we feeling about this one? Oh, we have some puzzled faces in the audience here. I think we're starting to get a little bit more uncomfortable, right, about the assumptions that this type of definition makes. And pharmaceuticals and medical devices have designated uses, right? So already some of the things that we would expect to be used are regulated in certain ways. So we've drawn another line here, presuming that we have clearly identified what a legitimate medical need is, right? And dare I even say, what is normal, right? This definition tells us we know where the line is, what's legitimate and what's not legitimate. Not super comfortable with that. I don't know, a lot of people aren't here. But thing is though, as we whittle down the context, I think we lose sight in all of the ways in which we can and do improve our cognitive capability. So that might be through exercise, nutrition, meditation, learning, but also the idea that these interventions may be acting on different capacities. They may be associated with different outcomes, different consequences, different advantages, disadvantages, side effects, different social acceptability. And so with all of these choices, okay, is it at all clear to you, around this wheel here, what's okay and what's not okay? So this is my question. With all of these choices, where are we drawing our ethical lines? And that's what my research is driven by, wanting to understand the ethical differences between all of these cognitive interventions. Why is using a notepad as a memory aid different from using a prescription stimulant? Why are students asking for prescriptions for stimulants and not just going out to take a run, to have a run, or meditate? Why is drinking coffee not considered academic doping? So where are these lines? Where do they exist? Where should they maybe exist that they don't exist now? So this is the general question in my research. And unsurprisingly, our ethical boundaries for now are being questioned and drawn around medicine and technology. And that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the talk. So most of my research is about neuropharmacology, methylphenidate and modafinil being kind of the bright and shining stars in the discourses at the moment, and they appear to be the most promising. Brain stimulation is also coming into the debates. TDCS, so transcranial direct current stimulation, especially given that it is a consumer product. So has everyone heard of TDCS or knows a little bit about it? So essentially, they are devices that look a lot like that picture there that you can put on your head, and they deliver electrical current through the scalp onto your brain on the area that you think is associated with whatever it is that you want to enhance or do better or maybe relax or, and if you're really keen, you can make one out of a 9-volt battery, right? You laugh. So, we're chuckling here, but there are step-by-step kits that you can find on the internet for making your own TDCS stimulator. How do people feel about this? Right? And so this isn't even like diversion of a medication. This is putting a 9-volt battery, like directly applying electricity to your head. How are we feeling about this in this healthcare provider space?
Very Black Mirror.
Yeah. Except not, because you can get this.
I mean, they do it all the time with ECT.
Yeah.
Exactly. In an extremely controlled environment, right?
Yeah.
That's it. I won't tell my medical students about that. Yeah. This is a consumer device. So one might expect that the ethical lines would be a little bit different. But even within this specific context of using neurotechnology for enhancement, I found dramatically different paradigms that are used to describe the same thing. So this was a study done looking at 3 different literatures on the non-medical use of prescription stimulants in university students. And I compared the bioethics literature, the public health literature, which were mostly the prevalence studies, and the print media. I found entirely diverging discourses on the same thing. So the public health literature focused on this idea that the non-medical use of stimulants by university students was an abuse, it was misuse, and it was illicit, okay? It was bad. So going back to the not responding to a legitimate medical need definition. So this was an alarming practice. Then you move into the bioethics literature. And it's the bioethics literature that really adopted this enhancement terminology, right? And it uses this word to convey the benefit, the opportunities that we could have if everyone was just cognitively enhanced. And I mean, now that space has even moved into moral enhancement. So can we enhance people's decision-making, people's morality? So forget about cognition, forget about the brain. Let's go directly to the choices that they're making. But that's a little bit of a digression. So the bioethics literature was looking at this, wow, not only whether using stimulants for enhancement was good or bad, but how can we make it good? How can we make it acceptable so we can reap all of these benefits? And the print media called it a lifestyle choice. And so this reflects well and truly the messages of the neuro society, right? To be the best you, to live your best life by making sure you have your best brain. So remember, these 3 literatures were reporting exactly on the same thing, and we came up with 3 entirely different discourses. So can you imagine what might happen if only one of them got picked up for public policy? Right? It's a tricky one because then you're necessarily adhering to one way of looking at it. Okay, so have I convinced you that it's really hard to define cognitive enhancement? Yes, we agree. Okay, so let's bring this down to some practical considerations. These, some of this data might help us think better through whether cognitive enhancement is ethically acceptable or not. So we're going to look at the key questions. How common is cognitive enhancement, and does it work? For fun. Do we think cognitive enhancement is prevalent? General population. Everyone's kind of heard of it. Everyone maybe knows a friend who's done something. Smirks, yes, then definitely knows a friend. How do we feel about it working? Do we think that something like a stimulant can help a otherwise healthy individual that doesn't have any attention problems perform better on an exam? We feel it work. You think it could work? Yeah, cool. Let's have a look. So in terms of prevalence, when we look at the international literature, we see that prevalence rates in university students range anywhere between 1 and 35%. And I'm sad to say that this range is the best that we have. It has been absolutely impossible to say this is the prevalence of cognitive enhancement. University students, for some reason, are the focus of all of these types of studies. And so it's university students, some are more focused on med students, some more focused on engineers, so it differs on specialty, but university students are really at the center of this phenomenon. And understandably so, it's a competitive environment. If there was anything in your life that you might want to be enhanced for, your studies are probably a reasonable place to start. In the general population, really the only figure that we have is this study that was done by the journal Nature. So they did a poll of their readers and they came up with 20%, but we can understand that nature readers are probably not a representative sample of the general population. You're getting all of the academics that are needing to pump out more papers, or people who have heard of this and thought it was interesting to respond in the poll. So 20%, does that seem reasonable, high, low? Seems high? Maybe. So what the prevalence studies have given us, though, are kind of a set of risk factors that we know, especially within the university population, might predispose someone to want to use a stimulant. So college location, if it's urban, rural, gender, males are more likely to use stimulants, lower average academic performance, fraternity membership. So if you're maybe in a context where substances are easy to find, that might be a risk factor, and history of drug use. So we do have these kind of these markers that have come out of the prevalence studies. But really, this is really difficult data to collect. Why? Because it's all self-report. So there's no litmus test. There's no way to control this. There's no lie detector. It's also something that people might not want to be talking about, right? If you've taken a stimulant to study or to write an essay or to do an exam, why would you tell anybody? Right? Might you be concerned of the discrimination, or perhaps the stigma, or the side eye that some of your colleagues may give? It's also highly context dependent. So saying that comparing prevalence might not always be super helpful, because it depends if maybe you're in a really competitive university. Maybe you have a circle of friends where a couple of your friends have prescriptions, and so they're easy to get. Maybe you're saying, hey, yeah, I'll give it a try. So there are lots of things in the context that might mean that prevalence changes. And there's also the contribution of whether these actually exist. So, prescription rates between countries, how something like a stimulant, how you can even get access to a stimulant, whether stimulants are part of medical practice, also very highly variable. So Germany is very, very low at 2%. Italy and Switzerland around 16, 17. The United Kingdom was 10. So it's really, really hard to say. So that's why I say that this range is kind of the best that we have. Let's look specifically at Australia. And there's been an increase in prescriptions for stimulants generally, which could be increasing the potential for stimulant diversion specifically. And the diversion is the main source of how people get these stimulants. There's a little bit of talk around online purchasing or feigning symptoms, but really the diversion is where you have a family member or a friend who's not using their pills, and you get access to them. And in the Australian university, so there have been 3 studies since 2013, one at 10%, which was a multi-state study. 6.3 was in Victoria, and 6.5 was in Queensland. And we do have a small general population sample from Queensland. It was done from a phone survey, and we found 2.4% of non-medical use of stimulants. But that's non-medical use of stimulants, period, not necessarily for cognitive enhancement. So you're also kind of, I think what we often forget that, people might just do this recreationally, right? That intention of being better might not be behind every single non-medical use. So let's have a think then. What does this data mean, right? Okay, we can go back and we can look 10%, 6.3%, 6.5%. Help me, so what? Is 10% high? Is 10% low? When do we start to worry? can we chat about this for a second? Because it would be interesting for me to hear from a healthcare professional perspective. Are we worried? You see that data. Are you worried about the university students?
I think I'm seeing side effects from it. So, am I seeing more stimulant, cases of people rocking up to ED with stimulant addiction, or, worsen other side effects from it, cardiac issues or anything like that? Then yes, otherwise not really.
I want to know the percentage of enhancement to know whether or not I'm going to not perform as well as those peers in a university assignment.
Okay,
Probably
so
number of people use it.
yeah, so it doesn't matter how many people are using it, but does it work? We're
Does it
getting
work?
we're getting to that soon.
They're not worried. They're not determined whether I worry about it or not.
Yeah. Okay, so we're not. So we have here. We're worried if there's harm associated with whatever number is, but it doesn't matter what the number is. If there's no harm, maybe it doesn't matter as much.
Yeah.
Okay,
If there's
then.
no harm, then everybody should be taking it. Maybe we should do that.
Woo! This is a bold suggestion. You-
Does that represent the views of Queensland?
Yeah. Does not represent the views of Queensland Health, is what we.
And if everybody took it, it wouldn't be an enhancement because everybody would be back at the level.
But you would be able to produce more and better quality stuff if you.
Right, because it doesn't matter then, yes, maybe we're redefining normal, but you're being the best you, you're living your best life. And that in and of itself is probably beneficial, right? So any other considerations about these numbers?
How much of it reflects on the treatment need?
Ooh, how much of it reflects? Thank you, Carla, because that is something that I didn't have time to put in. It's something that I didn't have the space to put in the presentation. But that's a really important consideration. So, are people self-medicating because maybe they don't have access, the time, resources? And it might not only be for attention, it might be for depression, anxiety. But again, we don't know. We don't have those numbers. And so what I'm hearing from the room here is that maybe those, those prevalence rates aren't actually helping us determine whether cognitive enhancement is ethically acceptable. It's not just about how common it is. So let's add another piece to the puzzle then. And I'd actually add to that, just before I move on, that the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare did publish a report in 2017 on the non-medical use of pharmaceuticals, and it states that the prevalence of stimulant use is too low to be considered. So they were mostly concerned about benzodiazepines, opioids, stimulants, not on the radar. Regardless of that, even if you take the 10%, right? You take the 10% of 1 million university students across Australia. It's still a lot of people. So does that reframing change what we thought about the data? Does that knowing that it's 10% of 1 million people? Are we a little bit more concerned? No, we want to know if it works. Okay, fine. Cynthia, move on. Something that happens a lot within the literature is that prevalence is conflated with demand, okay? So just because something is common, it doesn't mean that people want it. Okay, so I'd ask you to keep that in mind as we go over the next section and into the ethics. So on to the next big question: do these substances and devices work? And generally, I know I'm gonna surprise you with this here. There is no consensus. Okay, there's no resounding consensus about efficacy. Evidence is weak for most of the prescription medications. Modafinil, the sleep cycle regulator, appears to be one of the more promising ones. It's medication that is reported to be really well tolerated, so not a lot of side effects, reported to show moderate effects in helping people stay alert and concentrate. So this is one that we're hearing a lot about. And there are two considerations that are also talked about alongside efficacy. So just to bring, and the same for brain stimulation. So something like TDCS doesn't actually even have an indication, a medical indication yet. It's being investigated, especially for depression, but there's no medical indication, no huge evidence to show that this is applicable or works in healthy individuals. So these two considerations that are talked about alongside efficacy are, first, the idea that there's an enhancement ceiling, okay? That first there's inverted U dose response curve, and so the more you take, you're not necessarily getting more effect from it. But also the idea that you can only be enhanced so much. So people with lower baseline performance will see bigger enhancement, but if you have a higher baseline performance, then you're not getting enhanced very much. So there's a maximum to this enhancement. And the second is that there may be actually trade-offs that are made. So if you're enhancing one thing, are you maybe attenuating or impairing the function of another core capability? But also, what does that look like over the long term, right? If you're using this habitually, are you then maybe changing your brain chemistry, structure, the neural networks in a way that is irreversible, or are you changing them in a way that maybe you can concentrate, but your creativity, nah, that doesn't work as much anymore. And then doesn't matter. So even this idea, some of the prevalence studies show that, well, people are only using it sporadically, right? It's only, maybe twice a semester. And if we don't have that long-term, and it's not long-term use, then maybe we're not really fussed about it as much. So all big questions. So we reviewed kind of the safety and efficacy and prevalence. Is everybody familiar with the concept of the rate determining step? So in chemistry, a chemical reaction can only go as fast as its slowest step. And it's usually the step that needs the most energy, okay? And so it can only, that's it. It is the step that will determine how fast the chemical reaction will go. And my thinking is, and my question to you is our evidence in safety the rate determining step for deciding upon the ethics of cognitive enhancement? Do we need to know how safe or whether it works to be able to decide if this is something that we want as part of our society? Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
We end up with things like thalidomide or, all the problems they had with meth after World War II. That, we keep doing it all the time. It's just throwing out drugs and then going, oh, actually, this is not so good for you. Oh dear, now we have all these problems we need to mop up.
Okay, so we have a yes. Do we have a no?
I would say yes to efficacy, no to safety.
Yeah.
Yes to efficacy, no to safety.
Yeah.
Care to elaborate?
Just that safety is somewhat culturally, it's a context-specific term, so it could mean a few different things.
And I think safety, stopping something for being dangerous is not necessarily a good thing for society. I think there are many things in society that we do that are dangerous, but they enhance the way that we live.
Like what?
Like driving cars.
Driving cars. Okay.
It's a dangerous thing to do, and yet we carry on driving cars because they enhance our life.
Because the benefit outweighs that risk.
I mean, you can imagine that you can put cases, certain sorts of extreme circumstances in which you might justify doing things that you wouldn't under ordinary conditions.
Can you just repeat that so webinar people can hear what the comment was?
Can we get it from the origin?
That safety would be context specific, so there could be situations in which the requirement of safety was less important than under normal circumstances.
Yeah, good.
If you're going to talk about that, you've got to define safety. that basis because, as my colleague here said, driving a car is dangerous.
Yeah.
But we train for it and we do it without too much concept. But pop a few rupees under the tongue or a couple of extra values or half a bottle of scotch, and all of a sudden becomes a totally different thing. So then you talk about safety, you need to define what you're talking about safety. A whole pile of drugs in your system to enhance something equates what? Psychopaths, dull twits. You mentioned earlier in the piece about people with a lower performance getting a great enhancement, people with a high performance. Define above performance and high performance.
Mm-hmm. I can't.
Well, they're the terminologies we use, though, isn't it?
What? Yeah.
So that's the situation you're in. So, like anything of this type of nature, efficacy depends entirely on what the group accepts as viable, and safety is what is enhancing without being detrimental to the group.
That's really awesome. But that, we still have to make a decision around that, right?
Are we talking individual, we're talking collective?
Yeah. No, all really, really important questions. I unfortunately do not have the answers for you. I'm sorry to disappoint. But I think that these are the big questions that we're needing to ask around this evidence. We know that people feel safe taking prescription stimulants. Why? Because we give them to children, right? So they've got to be safe. So it's okay for, me, university student, to be taking this before my exam. Somebody's little kid takes them. So there's this sense of security that comes with it. But then we also see in other studies that even when participants are told hypothetical drug is safe, it works, would you prescribe it? Safety is still a major concern, even when they are assured that it is safe. So it goes back to your point before, is that safety, again, another very, very general term. And unless we're making a decision on exactly what potential effects or potential harm that we are willing to accept, then we don't know, yeah.
Did you find a gateway effect at all?
Gateway effect.
I would just saying, did you find a gateway effect where some enhancements led to stronger enhancements, one due to accept the concept? I know in June's case, driving cars can lead to motorbikes.
I don't know of any of that data, but what I do know with reference to kind of those risk factors, if there are other types of substances around, that you're more likely to use a stimulant. So
it's kind of like, would caffeine lead to modafinil?
I don't know. That's a really interesting question. Could caffeine lead to modafinil? But then again, the regulation is different, the access is different, the effects are probably different, so that's still a really big jump. Surely there must be something kind of between that. So my question with regard to the rate limiting step is this: do we need to prioritize research on safety and efficacy, or are there decisions that we can make around that before we go in full, we go in full to study safety and efficacy? But what's happened when you look at all of the evidence on safety and efficacy, there's this myth of cognitive enhancement that gets created, right? That it's common, that all of the university students are doing it, that it's a trend coming from America to here and the UK and Europe, where, none of this ever happened before. And it's this influence, and people want this and demand. University students absolutely want to be, taking stimulants to perform better and to do better, and the whole population should have it, because imagine what we could accomplish. So all of this evidence kind of gets put together to create that monolith of cognitive enhancement that I was talking about. And I think that to a certain extent does harm, because as we saw, it's not as prevalent as a lot of media reports seem to say. It doesn't actually work, at least not in the lab, as maybe some reports from the wild might see. So we have to be really, really careful about how we're integrating, assimilating, and talking about the evidence. Okay, last part. Let's go back to drawing those ethical lines. So is cognitive enhancement using various types of neurotechnology ethically acceptable? And there are so many issues that we can talk about, right? Some of them are medical. Is this, abuse? Are we maybe seeing overprescription? So this idea that there's so many stimulants around to be diverted, are all of them needed? Maybe we're prescribing too much, so maybe this is a medical problem. There are obvious regulation issues. So one of the prime critiques and challenges that I get when I talk about this is that people say, but it's illegal. Shouldn't be doing it anyway. There, ethics, done, solved. Right? It's illegal. Except that it's still happening. And if it's still happening, we have to have a mechanism, and we have to think around why and how it's still happening. Some of the really, really messy ethical issues are around autonomy. So do people feel pressure to do this? So we were talking before, if all my mates around were taking a stimulant and I felt that I needed to do this to get by, then I might feel coerced. Even though I feel like I have, the ability to self-determine and that this is a personal choice and it's okay if you do it, there might be peer pressure there. The idea of authenticity is one that doesn't get talked about enough. To say, well, if you are writing an exam or producing some kind of important piece of work under the influence of a stimulant, is it still yours? Is it still you? Is it your performance? So here is when the sports doping kind of gets recruited. Is it still your performance?
Same can be applied for alcohol and dancing, surely.
Alcohol and dancing, yeah. Except, it depends if it makes it better or worse, right? It could go either way, I think, on that one. The justice issues and the fairness issues are also really, really important. So there's the idea of cheating. If you look at it from a being the best that I can be, or just being my true self, then maybe it isn't cheating because it was there all along. You just brought it out, and you could have done it anyway. But when you look at, interpersonal differences, if one does it and succeeds and another one doesn't have access or doesn't do it and doesn't succeed, that's a disadvantage. So how do we deal with all of this? Again, a question that I don't have an answer for, I'm sorry. But what's important to keep in mind here is that all of these issues are interacting with one another. It's impossible to pull them apart.
And is there like an expectancy or placebo effect if I'm using it in terms of motivation? So, that's the question.
Yeah, so the question was about expectancy or effect on motivation, and we don't know. That's actually one of the new theories now, is that maybe it's not actually working on your concentration and your focus, it's just working on your motivation to do something. Maybe, could be. And so some attempts have been made to answer these questions and these issues, but they all take a very, very different approach. So the first one was the President's Bioethics Council from the US. I'm sorry, there are not actually any Australian equivalents to these policies. So the first one comes from the US, very conservative policy, and I'll go through it later. There was a British Medical Association discussion paper that just said, here are the issues, we don't really know. We'll look at the American Academy of Neurology advice. Another one here, this one up front, is also from the US, but a much more liberal take on it. So there's no consensus, there's no one way. What we find is very, very polarized policies. And the underlying philosophical debate and underpinnings are just that. So what we're seeing is this kind of tension between bioconservation, this idea that natural is best, right? You're born with it, you are thankful for it, you keep it, but you do not mess with it. Which contrasts with this more liberal and idea that, no, we actually have a moral duty to enhance. We have to be better. We've been doing it along. This is, whenever I read an essay or a paper, the history of humanity has been about enhancing. We've made ourselves better with, health care and tools and all. So this is just what we do. And if there is a benefit to be had, then we have an obligation to seek that benefit. So this is the underlying tension that cuts across the ethical debate. And then when we go and ask people about whether they think it's okay or not, we actually don't see that polarization. It's all a matter of degree, okay? And bringing in a lot of the points that we've already talked about. So it's okay, it's more acceptable to enhance traits that are not related to identity. So memory, no, don't enhance memory because that changes who you are. Alertness, yeah, okay, fine. But it's acceptable if it's enabling what was already going to be there, right? Enabling your true self. This idea of tapping into what you were always supposed to be. People are more tolerant of a drug or an enhancer that works as a normalizer, so that N-word that I really don't like. But if we're helping people come up to, a competitive level, or if we're helping people just be okay, then that's fine. But not beyond that, not an enhancer. You can enhance to the norm, whatever you decide that norm is. Enhancers are more acceptable if they're restoring cognitive function, so something that you were able to do, then maybe, so this is especially relevant in terms of cognitive decline, so maybe you lost it, but if we're getting you back up to something you've already done, then that's okay. But not beyond that, that's not okay. And so just this last study was from Sweden, seeing that the general public and general practitioners were not in support of pharmaceutical cognitive enhancement. So there wasn't this idea, not tapping into that bioethics perspective of benefit and that enhancement.
That's a long time ago now, however.
That is a long time ago now,
Yeah.
and you're right, and it hasn't been attempted since. So it'd be interesting to see how and if that's changed. So let's look specifically at the professional societies, and they've started to pay some attention to this broader phenomenon of the non-medical use of prescription drugs for lifestyle purposes. And one of the only position statements we have is this from the American Academy of Neurology, and I will draw your attention to these items 6 and 7. They essentially say, granting a patient's request for a neuroenhancer or a stimulant or whatever is neither legally nor ethically mandatory nor forbidden. So you don't have to grant it, you don't have to refuse it, you don't have to do anything. You have to make up your own mind, is what they do. So they put the ball right into your court. Is this helpful to you? And you can see how this kind of leaves it open for pluralistic practice. Leaves it open to doctor shopping or saying, oh, I know this person will grant it, this one might not. It means that the professions are not allied in how they're approaching, that there isn't a united front about what the message is. It means that there are different messages about whether enhancement actually fits into the purview of medicine or if it's not in the purview of medicine. So we talk a lot about the treatment enhancement distinction, which from an academic perspective is interesting to talk about. I don't know how helpful it actually is from a practical perspective. But what we see in empirical studies with healthcare provider stakeholders is that actually there is a certain reticence to bring enhancement into practice. So the first shows kind of ambivalence in, okay, it can be allowed, but we shouldn't encourage it too much, don't talk about it too much. Physicians so the second one is a Canadian study showing that physicians were uncomfortable prescribing, and the same for that Swedish study. And so if the people on the ground aren't actually willing to engage with this, then having that liberty to do so might not be as useful. So here's an example of one of the only medical associations who has actually taken a stand against medical practitioners or healthcare providers encouraging or granting these requests. This is the American Medical Association. It's the only one that says AMA believes physicians can support this goal by not prescribing any drug for the purpose of cognitive enhancement in otherwise healthy individuals. And interestingly, there is only one university, one academic institution that has included stimulants as part of their academic integrity policy, and that's Duke University, right? So for all of the focus on university students and for all of the alarm about all of these students taking stimulants for their assignments, only one university saw it serious enough to put it in their academic integrity policy. So there are really, really mixed messages about where this phenomenon fits. Now, what can we do, right? Because you're looking at it, you look at the evidence, you look at the Neuro Society, it's happening, right? That's it. Show of hands, cognitive enhancement is inevitable. Okay, 4. Show of hands, cognitive enhancement is not inevitable, sorry, it is evitable. 1, and a bunch of abstentions. Just, if we're reporting accurately here. And so even with that shaky efficacy data, even with that data about prevalence that we kind of decided in this room, doesn't really help us decide about the ethics, there still is this idea that cognitive enhancement is inevitable. So, it's too late to just say no to biomedical enhancements. They're already here and more are on the way. So this is it. And they should be viewed in the same general category as education, good health habits, and information technology, ways that our uniquely innovative species tries to improve itself. So this is the kind of thing that we've always been doing, that cognitive enhancement is equivalent to education and good health habits. I'm not sure I'm quite there yet, but maybe. And so now the task is to figure out how to deal with them. So the question is therefore not whether we need policies to govern neurocognitive enhancement, but rather what kind of policies we need. So our job now is to deal with it. And so there's been this, kind of pressure to debate this issue. I've already shown you, we don't really know what to call it. So we have difficulty naming and defining. We know more or less who is involved, but not to exactly what extent. The evidence around prevalence and whether it works is inconclusive. What we don't have, though, is so we have plenty of that evidence. What we don't have, though, is an idea of what the priorities are. So back to my question, is our priority about safety and efficacy, or is our priority going back to that long list of ethical issues to maybe decide on one of those that can help us see if, yeah, you know what, because, you know, we want the choice, we want our autonomy to be able to choose, then yes, we should be investigating safety and efficacy to promote that autonomy. Valid choice, but we have to make that decision. So I don't think this deterministic attitude is necessarily appropriate. I think there needs to be a lot more discussion. There is no inevitability as long as there is willingness to contemplate what's happening. And this is what I hope we've done during this hour. And I hope that I've brought you to contemplate that a little bit more. And here are some key messages that I hope you've taken away. That there are many types of cognitive enhancement. And so we've talked about stimulants here, but we shouldn't lose sight about all the other good things that are good for you that we do. Physical exercise, nutrition, mental stimulation, social engagement, all of these things that are good for you that are also cognitive enhancers. And that the ethical acceptability, even of those things, of neurotechnologies, of all of the other things and interventions that might arise, all of that depends on context. And for now, as healthcare professionals, it's up to you to decide how you think it's relevant to your practice, how you feel that you might be able to respond. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Cynthia, for an excellent presentation that's raised many questions in my head. Certainly, have we got any questions in the room?
There seems to be about like some of this ethical things. I could see that sort of moving across into, I guess, not necessarily just stimulants, but other sort of any psychoactive substance. So we seem to have, decided very much on a legal framework many years ago that was the way that we were going. Is there a lot of research in that area looking at like broader psychoactive substances, or have you just sort of looked at the cognitive enhancers?
Like what?
So things like psychedelics.
It's like hallucinogens hallucinogens are the latest thing that open up creativity in the mind. As my boss said, microdosing in Silicon Valley, and I know there's research going on at the moment about efficacy of that in a couple of countries. But that looks like being the future of cognitive enhancement.
I think that's the next step. I am really sad to say that there's been just like the tiniest incremental progress with figuring all of this out, okay? We have a lot of data, so lots of prevalence studies, a few efficacy studies within the limits of what you can actually test on healthy individuals, right? So don't forget that that's a rate limiting factor to that body of evidence, because research ethics are difficult in that space, okay? And a lot of the evidence that we have is actually the control subjects of clinical trials. And so all of these assumptions about efficacy are being made on that. And the trials that we have of, kind of pure healthy person cohorts studying the effects are tiny. And what are they? They're the people who study, they're the people who are recruited for these types of trials. So 18 to 24-year-old university students, right-handed in, university that has the funds to run these kinds of things, right? So the samples aren't diverse either. So we don't really know, but I think, so in this space there hasn't been as much progress, but I think that, the psychedelics are the new and shiny thing that are sparking interest. And I don't know if maybe that's because there hasn't been progress in this space, that, we're looking for other things, or maybe because that was just the next step. But you're right that that's on the horizon.
Any other questions in the room? I've definitely got one online which maybe I'll time to. Is there a concern for long-term use knowing these drugs work directly on the dopamine receptors? that they could actually cause long-term depression?
Thank you for that question. Yes, there is concern, but at this point, no hard evidence to show that it does. So it's kind of one of those vague, futuristic concerns that limits us when we talk about safety and efficacy, is that we don't know, but it's evident that people are willing to take that risk. And as I mentioned before, because a lot of the prevalence studies are telling us, oh, but it's only just occasional use. So I wonder if that discourages or dissuades or makes that set of data maybe less relevant, because we don't know what happens. We don't know if people graduate from university and carry on using stimulants in the workforce. We just don't know.
You mentioned that one university, I think in America, Duke University, actually has some legislation around control of that. As somebody that works in academia and cognitive enhancers growing in popularity, certainly media-wise with hallucinogens and that sort of thing, do you see more universities or more educational facilities following suit?
No, no, and this is why. How do you enforce that? Like, I commend Duke University. It's great that they've put it there. They've recognized that this is an issue. But how do you pull someone up on something like that?
You submit a UDS with your exam.
Well, I mean, and that's, people joke about that. Oh, we're going to have, urine tests with your exam. But really, that's kind of the only way. So I admire the statement that they've made in putting it in the academic integrity policy. But I don't know that it is, given the prevalence data, whether it is enough of a priority, whether the harm isn't pointing to needing some kind of policy for someone else.
Well, it also then perhaps creates the impression that more people are using it once you put it in a policy as well, and might normalise it. People go, oh, if I've got a policy, everyone's doing it.
Right, and that's, again, thank you very much for that, because that's something else that I think is relevant that I wasn't able to put in the presentation. But, we walk a really fine line, right, between prevention and encouraging. And so this is something, I don't know if it's relevant to you. I think it might be, but something that I've talked a lot about in terms of the media, right? So media reports, really interesting, investigative journalism that, goes from buying a stimulant online, testing it, documenting what all of the effects are, and then it gets published in Rolling Stone for lots of people to read, with all of those details about where to get it and how to do it and what it does.
Maybe you could survey this group of people to see if people use modafinil in 12 months' time.
Yeah. I'm not sure what the desired result would be.
But at least by putting it into the policy, it is starting to the process of talking about it. Otherwise, it's like everybody else, we don't want to know. Again, maybe the terminology of the enhancement is the wrong word.
Mm. Right, but it's a point about informed consent, right? It's this idea that people ought to know, they ought to have the right information, and then able to make up their own minds. And that we don't do any services by just not talking about it, because then it becomes that cool thing that, maybe I should try. Is this a secret that everybody else knows and that I don't know, and maybe I need to tap into that to attain my goals?
Well, let's face it, the best way to improve your sales is by prohibiting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Any further questions? No. In which case I would greatly like to thank Dr. Cynthia Forlini for a very engaging presentation.
Thank you.